All right, welcome to the first lecture of our population unit, and we're just going to go with Introduction to Population as title. So, some basic vocabulary that you need to understand, and most of these are actually on your vocab list, and if you're not familiar, you might want to go ahead and include them. So demography is the study of population characteristics. And by characteristics, we mean like the number of old people or the number of young people, the number of men, the number of women, number of people of a given racial or ethnic group, things like that is really what we mean when we're talking about population characteristics. The idea of population density, which is the number of people per square mile or square kilometer or some other measure of space. Okay, and we'll actually do a whole separate short lecture about population density. I just want to introduce the idea here to get you thinking about it. The ecumene is that part of the earth that has permanent human settlement on it. Okay, so this would include pretty much all of most of North America. Okay, pretty much all of Europe. Basically, we're looking at anywhere that is not too hot, not too cold, not too mountainous, okay, not too dry, that kind of thing. The doubling time is exactly what it sounds like. It's the amount of time it takes for a population to double its numbers. And that'll vary from population to population, and it's actually going to change across time, and that's one of those things that we're going to talk about as we go through this unit. And last but not least is the idea of zero population growth. And a lot of population theorists consider this to be really our goal. And zero population growth, on a very literal level, just means the population's not going up and it's not going down. So the number of people being born are equal to the number of people dying. Okay. When we talk about population, one of the things we like to talk about, and really makes sense to kind of lead with, is where do people live? People do live near the ocean or some other source of water. Roughly about 80% of the population lives within 800 kilometers or so, I think was the statistic I read, of the ocean or some source of water. Okay. They live in areas that are lower lying, areas where the soil is fertile, areas where the climate is temperate. In other words, they live in the areas where it's nice to live, where the climate is friendly, and where they can grow enough food to be able to support the community. Specifically, people tend to avoid living areas where it's too hot, things like deserts or similar sorts of areas, where it's too cold, think like the Arctic or the Antarctic, where it's too dry, again, deserts come to mind here. For too hot, certainly we find a lot fewer people living in areas like Arizona or New Mexico, which also again tend to be more desertous. Too mountainous. Populations in areas like the Rocky Mountains are significantly thinner than in areas like even the coastal plains. Okay, so again, people like to live in areas where, for lack of a better term, the environment is friendly and conducive to people getting by and people being able to support themselves, especially historically when people were growing their own food. Just a quick population density map. This one looks at number of people per kilometer, and you can see there's a handful of areas where there's more than 800 people per kilometer. Right? But by and large, in our densest areas, what we're really looking at is something in the area of basically anywhere from 1 to 800 people per kilometer. On the low end, we're really looking at 0 to 12. And one of those things about density, and we'll talk about this again as we get into the lecture about density, but density is a little bit misleading. And you'll notice, for instance, Alaska is listed as having 26 to 50 people per kilometer. What that doesn't tell you is that half of the people in Alaska live in one city. So it's talking about population densities in general can be very misleading in terms of population distributions. Okay, so a little bit of information just about the world today. We are well above 7 billion people. We reached 7 billion a couple of years ago. And as of October the 4th, we were at about 7.3 billion people. So more than 50% of people live in urban areas, that is to say in or near cities. Okay. 90% of people live north of the equator. 90% of the people live on 20% of the Earth's land. So think about, again, that idea of population density and how misleading that number can be. 80% of people live within less than 500 meters, 500 meters of elevation. Okay, so close to sea level. 500 meters, by the way, is about 1,500 feet high, or about a third of a mile. Okay, and about 2/3 of people live within 500 kilometers of an ocean, and a kilometer is about 3/5 of a mile. So think of that as being within about 300 miles of an ocean. Okay. Just going on to talk a little more about global population. Roughly about 2/3 of the world live in 4 major areas, and it is important that you know these areas. Okay. East Asia, which is basically China and those areas right around China. So China, Japan, Korea, those kind of areas. More than 1.5 billion people. About 20% of all people. And about 20% of all people live in China. And of that, about 50% are rural. And China's just finally starting to reach that tipping point. They might have actually reached it not too long ago, where there are finally more people in cities than there are in the countryside. South Asia, which is basically India and that area kind of down around there. So Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, right around there. Again, more than 1.5 billion people, and I think India is actually closer to 2 billion these days. Roughly about 20-25% of humanity. Okay, and of that, most of those folks live in India. India is rapidly overtaking China as being the most populated country in the world, and they're going to do that, I think, sometime in about the next 5 years. In India, about 60% of people live in rural areas. So stop and think about that. Only about 40% of people live in cities, and the rest live out in the countryside. And then we've got Southeast Asia, and these are Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. Okay, about 500 million people, roughly 8% of humanity. And again, more than 2/3 of these people are rural. One of those things I want you to notice about pretty much everywhere we've talked about so far is that they are less developed. Okay, Southeast Asia, depending on where we're talking about, some of those actually fall into the developing world. But East Asia and South Asia actually tend to fall into that developing world category. And I want you to think about, as we talk about population, we're going to talk a lot about levels of development and how that plays in. So I want you to make sure as we go that you understand that idea of development and how development influences population. Because it's going to be hugely important when we come to issues like natal policies and things like that. Okay. Europe is our last population cluster, and it's got about 3/4 billion people, which is roughly 11% of humanity, but about 3/4 of those people live in urban areas. And the thing about Europe is Europe's actually highly developed. There's obviously some differences within Europe. So when we're talking about Western Europe, which is like France, Spain, England, Germany, okay, those areas are very highly developed. Equal to, in many ways, the United States in terms of their levels of development. We start talking about Eastern Europe, then we start running into countries that tend to be more along those developing lines. So they show they're getting to developed, but they're not quite there yet. Okay, but they still show many of those developed world characteristics, in large part because they were under the influence of the Soviet Union for so long. So just some things to keep in mind when we talk about population, again, you do need to know those 4 major clusters. So if we look at a map of the U.S., and I would urge you to do this, pause the video for a moment, take a look, and see what you can see in terms of where are people clustered. You should notice a few major things. Okay. One is there's a major cluster on the East Coast that runs really from kind of New Hampshire down, right, New Hampshire, Massachusetts area down to about Washington, D.C. We call that area the megalopolis. And if you've ever driven the East Coast, you know that in many ways you're basically going, the whole time you're driving that length, and I've done it, you're going almost from city to city to city. Okay? It's a lot like driving, and you'll notice there's another pretty serious cluster here on the West Coast. Darker red, by the way, equals more people. It's a little bit like driving if you want to start in Everett and drive down to Tacoma, where you're never really out of the city. Okay? Even when you're on I-5 and you're driving through, even if you're not directly in the city, you're never really out of the city. You'll notice some other clusters down in California, certainly around kind of the middle of California. That's the LA area. Down Southern California, well, I guess that's San Francisco in the middle, and LA's down towards the bottom there. LA, San Diego, in that area. Okay, but what you'll notice is there's only a handful of areas in the middle of the country that are really dense, and every one of those areas, I can guarantee you, is a city. Okay, so even if you look at Western Washington, you know anything about the location of Spokane, right, you'll notice that little cluster that runs over the border, that's Spokane, Coeur d'Alene. Right, in Oregon, or not in Oregon, in Idaho, that little cluster on the border with Oregon, that's actually the Boise area. Okay, let's see, what do we got going on here? In Colorado, okay, that's the Denver area where you see the deeper cluster. Okay, Utah, that's Salt Lake City and thereabouts. Okay, so everywhere in the middle where you see large densities, it's a city. Most of that area, though, a lot of that area is farm area, unless we're talking about kind of the western part of the Midwest, which is to say Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, parts of Colorado. It's very much that those areas tend to be much more deserty, but most of the rest of it, very arable land, lots of farms, and even those areas where it's not conducive to growing crops, it is conducive to growing animals and the like. So that's our introduction to population, and thank you for watching. And if you have any questions, please feel free to come see me during class, and I'd be delighted to answer them.